Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Jai Radha Gopinath Shri Radhe Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajacharya Shri Shri Srimad His Divine Grace Abhay Charanaravindra Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajacharya Shri Srimad His Divine Grace Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Maharaj Prabhupada Ki Jai. Ananda Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai. Samavita Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai. Jai Nitai Gaur Premanande. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. This morning we're reading from Canto 3, Chapter 7, Further Inquiries by Vidura. Text number 21. Shrishtvagre mahad adini. Srishtvagre mahad adini. Savikarani anukramat. Savikarani anukramat. Tebhyo virajam udhrutya. Tebhyo virajam udhrutya. Tamanu pravishad vibhu. Tamanu pravishad vibhu. Srishtvagre mahadadini. Savikarani anukramat. Tebhyo virajam udhrutya. Tamanu pravishad vibhu. Srishtvagre mahadadini. Savikarani anukramat. Tebhyo virajam udhrutya. Tamanu pravishad vibhu.
Srishtvagre mahadadini.
Srishtvagre mahadadini.
Savikarani anukramat.
Savikarani anukramat.
Tebhyo virajam udhrutya.
Tebhyo virajam udhrutya.
Tamanu pravishad vibhu.
Tamanu pravishad vibhu. Srishtvagre mahadadini. Srishtvagre mahadadini. Savikarani anukramat. Savikarani anukramat. Tebhyo virajam udhrutya. Tamanu pravishad vibhu. Srishtvagre mahadadini.
Srishtvagre mahadadini.
Savikarani anukramat.
Savikarani anukramat.
Tebhyo virajam udhrutya.
Tebhyo virajam udhrutya. Tamanu pravishad vibhu.
Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Translation. After creating the total material energy, the Mahat Tattva, and thereby manifesting the gigantic universal form with senses and sense organs, the Supreme Lord entered within it. Purport. Fully satisfied by the answers of sage Maitreya, Vidura wanted to understand the remaining portions of the creative function of the Lord, and he took the clue from the previous topics. We'll continue for some verses because the purports are just a sentence long. Text 22. Yamahur adyam purusham sahasangri urubahukam yatra vishva ime lokaha savikasham ta'asate. The Purusha incarnation lying on the causal ocean is called the original Purusha in the material creations, and in his Virat form, in whom all the planets and their inhabitants live, he has many thousands of legs and hands. Purport. The first Purusha is Karanodakashai Vishnu. The second Purusha is Garbhodakashai Vishnu. And the third Purusha is Kshirodakashai Vishnu, in whom is contemplated the Virat Purusha, the gigantic form in which all the planets with their different developments and inhabitants are floating. Yasmin dasha vida pranaha sendriyarthendriyastrivrit tvayerito yato varnas tadvibhutir vadasvanaha. Translation: O great Brahmana, you have told me that the gigantic Virat form and his senses, sense objects, and 10 kinds of life air exist with 3 kinds of life vigor. So this is something we discussed, I think, a couple of chapters ago. So the 10 kinds of life air, the 5 pranas, and then the secondary pranas like Devadatta, Dhananjaya, etc. And the 3 kinds of life vigor were in reference to the Adhyatma, Adidaiva, and Adibhautika. Now, if you will kindly explain to me the different powers of the specific divisions. Yatra putrescha putrescha naptribhi sahagotra jai praja vichitra kritaya asanyabhir idam tatam. O my Lord, I think that the prowess manifest in the forms of sons, grandsons, and family members has spread all over the universe in different varieties and species. Prajapatinam sapatish chaklape kan prajapatin sargamshchaivanu sargamshcha manun manvantaradipan. Translation: O learned Brahmana, please describe how the leader of all the demigods, namely Prajapati, Brahma, decided to establish the various manus, the heads of the ages. Please describe the manus also, and please describe the descendants of those manus. The human race, or Manusha, Sara, descends from the manus, sons and grandsons of the Prajapati, Brahma. The descendants of Manu reside in all the different planets and rule all the universe. We'll just read one more verse. Uparyadascha ye loka bhumir mitratmajasate tesham samstam pramanam cha bhurlokasya cha varnaya. O son of Mitra, kindly describe how the planets are situated above the earth as well as underneath it, and also please mention their measurement as well as that of the earthly planets. Purport: Yasmin vigyate sarvam evam vigyatam bhavati. This Vedic hymn declares emphatically that the devotee of the Lord knows everything material and spiritual in relationship with the Lord. Devotees are not simply emotional, as is ill-conceived by certain less intelligent men. Their direction is practical, and they know everything that is and all the details of the Lord's dominion over the different creations. Om Jnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshunmetam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruye Namah. Shri Chaitanya Manobhashtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Utapadakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Mitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamsha. He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostave Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Haripriya Vancha Kalpaturubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasari Gaur Bhaktivinoda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So just to recap this chapter, because there's many nice lessons that we can learn from what's happened so far in this chapter. It started off with a question by Vidura to his Guru Maitreya. And it's explained that Vidura approached Maitreya, and he's already asked numerous questions to him. But this question was asked in a pleasing way. So we know the famous case study example that Srila Prabhupada quotes or makes it apparent to us in the Bhagavad Gita of Arjuna asking Krishna about how he knows when the Bhagavad Gita was spoken. How is it that you, Krishna, and the sun god are contemporaries? How can I understand this? Recently I was reading in Teachings of Lord Chaitanya about Sanatana Goswami. First of all, when I was reading the Vaishnava K book, I came across a picture of Sanatana Goswami paying obeisances, touching and rather grasping the lotus feet of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, just wearing a gamcha, shaved head, shikha, because as we know, when he first came to meet Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in Varanasi, that time he had grown a beard actually, and he looked like a Muslim mendicant. So he was fully shaven, grasping the lotus feet of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and he had a grass in his mouth. And Sanatana Goswami explains that by material estimation, it may seem that I'm very educated, I'm a very erudite scholar. Srila Prabhupada explains that both Rupa Goswami and Sanatana Goswami were proficient in many different languages, including Arabic and Persian as well. So the Mughals, when they came to India, they were coming from Persia and Afghanistan. So they brought the Persian language, they brought the Arabic language, because the Arabic language is the holy language of the Muslims. So Sanatan and Rupa Goswami were proficient in these languages. They were also ministers, chief ministers to the Nawab of Bengal. So they were good in diplomacy and politics and all these different things. So by material estimations, someone like Sanatana Goswami was in a very, very high position. But he explained to Lord Chaitanya that the very fact that I don't know who I am, what is my identity? My associates are all meat eaters, very lowly persons. I was born in a very, my occupation is very lowly. That's another reason why Sanatana Goswami didn't enter the Jagannath Puri temple as well. So in this way he was beseeching Chaitanya Mahaprabhu for his mercy. So this is the proper attitude that we should inculcate to ask questions, because the very fact that we're asking questions to someone else means that we're in a position of ignorance. We know less than the person whom we are asking the question to. And therefore we should be humble. We should inquire humbly, and as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, we should render service to that person so that we can actually understand the answer which is going to be given to us by that person. I think a couple of weeks ago we were discussing the verse that Radheshyam Prabhu mentions. Vedam vivadaya dhanam madaya shakti paresham paripidanaya. So these are the, you could say, the adverse effects of the different varnas. Right? So you have the brahmanas, and the brahmanas are supposed to be educated in knowledge, right? They're knowers of Brahman, and they're supposed to educate society. But sometimes that mode of goodness can turn into the mode of passion. And instead of engaging in samvad, right, they can engage in vivad. They can argue with someone just to prove their point. So this is an adverse or contrary quality of a brahmana. Similarly, a vaishya, dhanam madaya, they can misuse their wealth for their own profit, to exploit someone else, in terms of a monetary way. And shakti paresham paripidanaya. The kshatriyo hi praja rakshan, are supposed to give protection to the civilians, not just physical protection, but Srila Prabhupada mentions protection from the eternal enemy of the soul, which is lust. It's not the eternal enemy of the soul. As long as the soul is in the material world, conditioned, lust is the enemy of the soul. So the Kshatriyas are supposed to give protection from this. But the Kshatriya may misuse his power to exploit someone who's weaker than him. So all these different misconceptions are based on a misconception in identity. Right? In the Vedic culture, we have this thing called Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojan. Right? So some people say that the Sambandha is dependent on the Prayojan. Right? Our identity is dependent on the goal that we are trying to reach. But it's also a fact that the Prayojan as well as the Abhideya is based and dependent on the Sambandha. And what is that Sambandha? We learn in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Dehinosmin yatade komaram yovanam jana. He says all these verses, Avinashitu tadvidyenam sarvamidam tatam. Right? You are the spirit soul. That's a good identity for us to establish ourselves as being something distinct from matter. Right? We're spirit soul, we're distinct from matter. And that's a good identity. In of itself, it's a good identity to take us to Brahman. But the devotees of Krishna are not trying to reach Brahman. They're not satisfied with just understanding that they're the spirit soul. Right? Our prayojan, ultimately, is to reach the transcendental abode. Right? Vrindavan, Golok Vrindavan, the spiritual world. And we have to instill an identity, a sambandha within us, which is consistent with the prayojan that we're trying to reach. So if that prayojan is Tad Dham Parama Mama, Vrindavan Dham, then what does that Vrindavan Dham consist of? It consists of Krishna. Krishna is everywhere in Vrindavan, and Krishna's devotees are also everywhere in Vrindavan. So we need to instill an identity within ourselves, which is in relationship not just to our identity as being something spiritual and not matter, but in relationship with Krishna and in relationship with Krishna's devotees. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu gives the answer when he says, Naham vipro nacha narapatir napi vaisho na shudro naham varni nacha grihapatir no vanasto yatirva kintu prodya nikila paramananda purnamritabdir gopi bhartu padakamalyor dasa dasanudasa. So this identity that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is instilling tells us that first of all, we're nothing material, because he says, I'm not part of the Varnashram system, which is material. Right? So I'm not material, I'm spiritual. Then he says, I am the servant of the servant of the servant of Krishna, of the lotus feet of Krishna, who is the maintainer of the gopis. So here we have a perfect identity, which is spiritual and not material, and in relationship with Krishna and Krishna's devotees. If we have this identity, then it's very congenial for us to advance in devotional service. So in this way, in this humble way, Vidura inquires to Maitreya Muni. And rightly so, he asks him about two questions. As we know, we've been discussing this for the past couple of weeks. The first was about Ishvara. How is it that a transcendental personality like Krishna can come into contact with something material, something inferior? How is it that the superior energy can create something inferior from it? Right? So we've discussed about the example of the sun. The sun, which is the superior energy, and the inferior energies of the sun, like snow, rain, darkness, and clouds. Right? We discussed that. And then Vidura asks about the conditioned soul. How is it that the conditioned soul, which is spiritual and always related to Krishna, how is it that the spirit soul engages in activities which are detrimental for it to go back to Godhead? Even though Paramatma is within the heart of the soul, within our body, why is it that we act in such a way? And Srila Prabhupada quoted Jiva Goswami and Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur about the example of the moon and its reflection on the surface of the water. Right? And we also came across that famous, not famous, but amusing analogy of the head being cut off, where the teacher scares the pupil by saying, look, if you misbehave, then I'm going to cut off your head, and I'm going to hang your head on top of the classroom wall. And then what happens? The child gets scared, and then the child starts to behave. But just as it's not possible for us to see our head being cut off and hung on the wall, similarly, it's not possible for the spirit soul to be covered by matter. It's not possible for the spirit soul to be covered by matter and to become matter and to engage in the mature world in that platform. But the influence of the false ego makes us think in that way. So that was that. So these two questions were answered by Maitreya Muni to Vidura. And then he's been glorifying Vidura after getting these answers from Maitreya Muni. He starts to glorify three things. He starts to glorify the process of devotional service, the process of Krishna consciousness. He starts to glorify the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Shri Shri Radha Gopinath Ki Jai. And he starts to glorify the Guru, and specifically how we should approach the Guru. And I came across, I remember my Guru Maharaj was giving a lecture about the consciousness of Akrura as he was approaching Vrindavan. Right? When Akrura was approaching Vrindavan, he was sitting on a brand new chariot, and he was approaching Vrindavan. And all the while he was meditating on Krishna, on Balaram, on the residents of Vrindavan, and how Krishna would forgive him for coming to Vrindavan, to take him away. Krishna would understand that he's helplessly working for Kamsa. Shri Shri Radha Gopinath Ki Jai. And in this way, Akrura was constantly meditating on Krishna and Krishna's mercy. And then when Akrura came to Vrindavan finally, at the end of the day, Srimad Bhagavatam explains that he got off his chariot and he very ecstatically rolled on the dust of Vrindavan. And the verse in Srimad Bhagavatam explains that Akrura gave up three things in order to attain the mercy of Krishna. The three things, it says, Hitva, Dambam, Bhayam, and Shucham. Hitva, Dambam, Biyam, it says it, Biyam. Hitva, Dambam, Biyam, Shucham. So what are these three things? Akrura gave up pride, Dambam. Akrura gave up fear, Biyam. And Akrura gave up Shucham, or lamentation. And how did Akrura give up Damba, pride? Well, the Acharyas explained that Akrura was coming from a very wealthy, aristocratic, royal background. He was one of the ministers of Kamsa. But where was Akrura coming to? He was coming to a simple cowherd village. So we can see in mature life, if we possess some opulence or some quality, some physical characteristic even, or some skill, which is surpassing the skill or opulence or quality of others, then naturally we get proud. If we're more physically beautiful, then we always compare ourselves with people who are less physically beautiful, and we get proud. If we're more rich than someone, then we get proud as soon as we may go into a suburb which is less affluent or something like that. Right? So we always are comparing. But here we have a situation where Akrura, coming from a royal background, is coming to a simple cowherd village where the opulence is not beautiful pillars ornate with gemstones and all this sort of stuff, but the opulence of Vrindavan is just its minerals, red oxide minerals. Srimad Bhagavatam explains gunja malas, and the purports, the acharyas explain like this. Just simple things, peacock feathers. This is the opulence of Vrindavan. So Akrura, he gave up his pride in coming to meet with Krishna. He gave up his fear, because if Kamsa found out Akrura's real motive in coming to Vrindavan, which was against what Kamsa actually wanted to do, right? Akrura wanted to go and meet with Krishna and console him, and wanted to make friendship with Krishna. But if Kamsa found out that Akrura was not fully 100% working for him, then that would be a cause of fear, because his life would be jeopardized when he came back to Mathura. So in this way, Akrura gave up his fear for his own body. And not just his own body, like his own position as well. Akrura could be fired from his position as well. And sometimes when we come to bhakti, we fear for these things. Especially if we join the ashram, we fear, oh, what will happen to me in old age? Let's say if I leave the ashram, then how will I support myself monetarily? I'll lose all my experience that I've gained previously before joining the ashram. That's something we see that happens to Mrigari as well. When Narada Muni approaches Mrigari and he says, give up your hunting business and just sit down and chant, the first thing Mrigari says is that this is something I've been doing for generations. This is my tradition, my family tradition, to half-kill animals. Of course, first he tells him to fully kill the animals, but then he says, just sit down and chant. Then what does Mrigari say? He says, but how will I maintain my family? And Narada Muni consoles him. Don't worry, I'll arrange for everything. People will give you donations. Like that. So we may have this fear when we're approaching Krishna. Fear for our material position, fear for our body, fear for our relatives. And then Akrura gave up shucham, which is lamentation. And specifically the Acharyas explain this in relationship with his family. Akrura's family was left behind in Mathura. So if Kamsa found out that Akrura was not fully in accordance with his desires, then Akrura's family might get harmed as well. So I was sort of taking these three things and applying them to another personality as well, who approaches the Supreme Personality of Godhead for shelter, and that is Vibhishan. So we see that when Vibhishan, he comes flying, he has a quarrel with Ravana, because he tries to advise Ravana to give Sita back to Ram, otherwise she will be the cause of the destruction of the Rakshasas, numbering something like 65 million in Lanka. So upon having the quarrel, then Vibhishan, he leaves Ravana. Just like Vidura, he left Dhritarashtra as well, because of the quarrel. He hung up his bow on the door of the palace, and he left. So these three qualities, which are to be given up, pride, fear, and lamentation, Vidura has also given up these things as well. But anyway, let's talk about Vibhishan. Vibhishan comes flying across the ocean with some of his close companions, supporters, and then he lands on the shore of the ocean where the monkeys are and where Lord Ramachandra is. So we see that Vibhishan also is coming from a very aristocratic background. He's also the chief advisor, a minister in the court of Ravana. But here he's coming and joining an army of monkeys, seemingly an uncivilized army of monkeys, who were not wearing any armor. Their only weapons were just trees, stones, mountain peaks. And Lord Ramachandra and Lakshman, they're also Kshatriyas, but here they are dressed in tree barks. They have matted hair. So he gave up the pride of him coming from a royal background, and he joined such an army. So Vibhishan also gave up these things as well. He gave up his fear along the same lines as Akrura, in the sense that he didn't care about his position, which was left behind in Lanka. He didn't care about giving that up. He didn't care about him being killed by Ravana as well for betraying him and coming and serving and making alliance with Ramachandra. And finally, he gave up his lamentation, again for the same reason, because Ramayana explains that when Vibhishan came across and met with Ramachandra, he left his wife. His wife was left behind in Lanka. So Ravana could have come and exploited Vibhishan's wife, Vibhishan's family. He could have killed Vibhishan's family. But Vibhishan, he gave up this family attachment, this lamentation of worrying so much about his family. And he came and he fully surrendered at the lotus feet of Ramachandra. And we see this consistent attitude with our acharyas as well. Like many of our acharyas, like as we were talking about Rupa Goswami, Sanatana Goswami, they also gave up their families, their positions. Raghunath Das Goswami, he gave up his beautiful young wife, his parents, his wealth, and he also came and fully surrendered at the lotus feet of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So these are some of the qualities that we need to develop. So after glorifying the mood in which we should approach the Guru, to advance in Krishna consciousness. Vidura, in yesterday's verse, he glorifies something interesting. He says, let me just get it here. This is in text 20. He says, persons whose austerity is meager can hardly obtain the service of the pure devotees who are progressing on the path back to the kingdom of God, the Vaikunthas. Pure devotees engage 100% in glorifying the Supreme Lord, who is the Lord of the demigods and the controller of all living entities. Srila Prabhupada explains that, well, at least in this translation, it's explaining that there's many different austerities that we can do in bhakti, right, to get punya, some sort of kriti, sukriti in bhakti. For example, when we talk of Tulsi Marani, we have that famous verse, Yadrishtva Nikilaga Sangha Samani Sprishta. Just by looking at Tulsi Marani, Sangha Samani Sprishta, Vapu Pavani, our body, it gets purified. Our Vapu, our physical form gets purified. Roganam Abhivandita, just by paying obeisances to Tulsi Marani, all the diseases we have, they get purified as well. They get vanquished as well. By watering Tulsi Marani, the fear of Yamaraj gets avoided. We avoid that fear of Yamaraj coming at the time of death. By planting Tulsi Marani on the earth, then what happens? Then one comes closer to Krishna. By placing a Tulsi leaf at the lotus feet of Krishna, one gets vimukti phalada. The fruit of this is one gets the supreme liberation of going back home, back to Godhead. So just by doing these simple things, like in relation to Tulsi Marani, one increases one's piety in bhakti, transcendental piety in bhakti, which then gives us more bhakti and is an impetus for us to continue on with more faith in bhakti as well. Another thing which I've seen devotees do, like I think Prabhu was mentioning about doing a parikram around the deities, around Radha Gopinath. It's not possible now, unfortunately. But still I've seen, for example, Prem Sagar Prabhu. He'll start in the kitchen and he'll go through the kitchen, through the back, through the car park, and like that he'll do parikram around Radha Gopinath. So one other interesting thing I read is that the Supreme Personality of Godhead appears in 5 different ways. First of all, he comes as his Swayam Roop, which is known as Para. Then the Para expands into the expansion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Just like how we have Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and then we have Nityananda Prabhu, who is the expansion, and then we have the incarnation, who is Advaita Acharya. So in the same way, this Para, Swayam Roop Krishna, expands into the expansion, which is known as Vyuha. Vyuha. The Sanskrit name is Vyuha. Then this expansion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead further expands into the incarnation, which is known as Vaibhava. The Vaibhava expands into the Super Soul, which is known as Antaryami. And the Antaryami expands into the deity form of the Lord, which is known as Archa. So these are the 5 expansions of Swayam Roop Krishna. And it's explained in Srimad Bhagavatam that each expansion has within it the qualities of all the preceding forms. So for example, if we talk about the Vyuha, or the expansion of the Para, it has within it the qualities of the Para. If you talk about the Vaibhava, or the incarnation of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, it contains within it the qualities of the Vyuha, the expansion, as well as the qualities of the Para, Swayamru Krishna. So the Acharyas make it the point that we should simply focus our efforts, especially in Kali Yuga, to worship the Archa Vigraha form of Krishna through the chanting of the holy name. Why? Because within the Archa Vigraha is Antaryami, fully manifest. Within the Archa Vigraha, because Antaryami is there, therefore the incarnation is also there. Vaibhava is also there. Because Vaibhava is there, then Vyuha is also there, and because Vyuha is there, then the source of Vyuha, which is Para, Swayam Rup Krishna, is also inside the form of Sri Sri Radha Gopinath. Therefore the devotee with great faith worships the Supreme Personality of Godhead in the form of the Archa Vigraha. So there's many other ways in which we can perform austerities and increase our piety and bhakti. Srila Prabhupada encouraged us to do Ekadashi. We can take Charanamrit, just like if you read the 2 verses there where the Charanamrit usually goes. You'll see that it saves us from Akala Mrityu, untimely death, and it also gives us devotion to Krishna as well. And I was discussing with a devotee a couple of weeks ago about how, like Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, that if we don't complete our devotion, if we don't complete our devotional service 100% in this lifetime, then in the next lifetime we'll carry on. We'll get a favorable birth, and maybe with some other devotees or some brahmanas or some aristocratic family, and we'll continue our devotional service. But in this lifetime, we are fortunate to have used our free will properly and come to Krishna consciousness. We don't know if we're going to use our free will properly in the next lifetime, if we don't complete our bhakti in this lifetime. We don't know if we're going to use our free will properly and choose Krishna again in the next lifetime. But I was thinking that if in this lifetime, nevertheless, if we accumulate so much bhakti sukriti, just like it's mentioned in the Srimad Bhagavatam, that the cowherd boys, they got to the position of being able to wrestle with Krishna and play with Krishna. Why? Because lifetime after lifetime, they cultivated and accrued so much krita punya, which eventually took them to the position of directly associating with Krishna themselves. So in this lifetime, if we accrue so much bhakti piety by intensely engaging in devotional service, it will be like an avalanche, that bhakti piety, which will in one sense force us or make it easier for us in our next lifetime to choose Krishna consciousness. So in this way we should increase our austerity in bhakti, we should increase our piety in bhakti, because that will save us in the next lifetime if we don't complete our devotional service in the current lifetime. But, however, Vidura tells in yesterday's verse, he says, even if one doesn't have the backing of austerities, even if one doesn't have the backing of bhakti sukriti, doing one thing can still counteract all these things. And that is serving the devotees, serving the Mahatmas. What does he say? He says, persons whose austerity is meager can hardly obtain the service of the pure devotees who are progressing on the path back to the kingdom of God. And then Prabhupada mentions in the purport, he says, the path of liberation as recommended by all authorities is to serve the Mahatma transcendentalists. So even if you can't do all these things, you can't fast on Ekadashi, you can't preach for some reason, right? You're not able to worship Tulsi Mani, you're not able to come to the temple and take darshan of the deity form. Still, somehow or other, if you serve the Mahatmas, that itself counteracts for any lacking which is there in anything else in bhakti. So that should be our focus, just serving the devotees. And that requires qualification from our side as well, from the disciple and from the spiritual master. Just like another analogy given in Srimad Bhagavatam is that of the sunshine. The same sunshine, it is shining on different plants. And that sunshine which is shining on different plants, some plants, they die because of the sunshine. And some plants, they grow very lusciously because of the sunshine. Sometimes the sun is shining and it shines on our head. And that same sunshine is also shining on our body. But when it shines on our head, it may be very annoying. But when it shines on our arms or our chest or our legs, it may be very pleasing. So in the same way, we as the disciple have to be receptive to Krishna's mercy. The mercy is equal. The dust of the lotus feet of the Vaishnavas is equal to everyone. But I read something very interesting. When we commit a Vaishnava aparad, the devotee to whom we commit a Vaishnava aparad, they may be very elevated and pure and transcendental, so that they may not take our offense seriously. In fact, that offense that we commit, they may just brush it aside, and they may be completely unaffected by it. In other words, it may not be a Vaishnava aparad from their perspective. Right? But just as Chitraketu mocked Shiva, but Shiva didn't take it personally. Shiva was not offended. But who was offended? Lord Shiva's wife, Durga Devi. She got offended and she cursed Chitraketu. In the same way, it is mentioned by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he explains that if we commit a Vaishnava aparad to a very elevated Vaishnava, he or she may not take the offense seriously. But the dust of the lotus feet of that Vaishnava will take the offense seriously. And we will still get the fruit of the offense given by the dust of the lotus feet of the Vaishnava. That's why even if we know in our heart, we feel that we've offended someone, and if that Vaishnava doesn't take it seriously, he or she is not affected by it, still the dust of the lotus feet of that Vaishnava will give us the fruit of that offense. So it's explained by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur that we should nevertheless continue to always serve and be a servant of the Vaishnava whom we have offended, even if that Vaishnava doesn't take that offense seriously. And I just finished with this interesting thing. Just because Sanatana Goswami, we were talking about Sanatana Goswami in the beginning, talking about bhakti and how causeless it is, because what we're seeing right here in Srimad Bhagavatam, like in today's verses that we just read, there's no real reason for Maitreya Muni to give this transcendental knowledge to Vidura. There's no reason for him to do it. He's not being paid to do it. But it is the causeless mercy which is acting through Maitreya, coming from Krishna, which is giving and bestowing that mercy to a qualified recipient, who is Vidura. When Sanatana Goswami, he ran away from his government position in Bengal, right? He made the escape, you know the story. He got the 10,000 gold coins from his brother Rupa Goswami, who had left it, and then he bribed the local jailer, right, in the jail of the Nawab. First he gave 5,000 gold coins. Then the jailer said, no, still, I can't do it. I might get in trouble. My family might be killed. I might be killed. Then he gave another 5,000 gold coins. And he gave him an excuse as well. If the Nawab comes, you give him this excuse. And you keep the money. And then he said, finally he said, okay, fine. So then Sanatana Goswami made the escape. And he took the back roads, right? The paths which are not trodden regularly by people. The back alleys, the forest paths. And in this way, eventually he made his way to some hotel keeper. Some hotel was there in some really hilly part of the land. And he found out that the hotel keeper wanted to actually kill Sanatana Goswami because he found out from an astrologer that he was keeping some gold coins with him still. Then Sanatana Goswami approached his servant Ishan and he asked him, are you keeping some gold coins? He said, yes, I still have 7-8 gold coins left. Then he chastised him and he said, give me these coins, and he gave it to the hotel keeper. And the hotel keeper actually revealed to him that, yes, I was actually going to kill you tonight. But you're a very truthful person, so I won't kill you. So I'll help you. But he says, if I don't give it to you, then someone else will kill me later on for these coins. So better that you take it, now that I know that you were trying to kill me. Better that you take it. So he gives the coins to him, and then the hotel keeper helps him over this hilly tract of land full of forests. And Sanatana Goswami, he leaves behind Ishan, gives him a gold coin and tells him to go back to Bengal. And finally he reaches Varanasi, where he meets with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And that's where he comes with a beard. And he has a blanket which is given to him by one of his relatives, a new blanket. But anyway, when he comes to the house he hears that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is at the house of Chandrasekhar. So he comes to the house of Chandrasekhar, and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, being fully cognizant, Supreme Personality God, he understands that his dear devotee is outside. So he asks Chandrasekhar to go outside and bring the Vaishnava who is standing outside. And Chandrasekhar, he goes outside and he tells Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, I looked, but I can't see any Vaishnava here. Then he says, go again, he's there, and he says, all I can see is a Muslim mendicant. Mahaprabhu says, he's not a Muslim mendicant, he's Sanatana Goswami. Right? So then and then he comes inside, and then at that point in time, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu embraces the emaciated body of Sanatana Goswami. And what does Sanatana Goswami say? He says, my dear Lord, please do not embrace me. I am very impure. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says, that is not true. I am embracing you just to purify myself. Your purity is so great, your devotion to me is so great, that it can deliver the entire world. So this is the reciprocation between the perfect disciple and the perfect guru. Then Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says that Lord Krishna is very kind upon you because he has saved you from Maharorava. Mahaprabhu says this to Sanatana Goswami. And what does Sanatana Goswami say in return, in reciprocation? He says, my dear Lord, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, I do not know about the mercy of Krishna. I do not understand the mercy of Krishna. But I can understand that your mercy upon me is causeless. So the Acharyas discuss about the causeless nature of bhakti. What causes bhakti to arise? Does bhakti arise by luck, by chance, spontaneously? Does it arise like that? They say that is Shubha karma, they say pious acts, pious activities, is that the result of bhakti arising in our hearts? But then the Acharyas explain that this can't be. Because if bhakti came by pious activities, karma-kandic activities, then that would mean that bhakti is dependent on Shubha karma. But we see that bhakti is independent of Shubha karma. Then one may say that does bhakti arise because of the mercy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead? Then one may ask the question, but what is the qualification to receive that mercy from the Supreme Personality of Godhead? What do I have to do in bhakti to receive that mercy from the Supreme Personality of Godhead? Will Krishna give me his mercy just because I chant 16 rounds? Will Krishna give me his mercy just because I follow the 4 principles? Or just because I give 300 classes in a year? Or because I perfectly perform all the Ekadashi vrats throughout the year? Is this the reason or the cause that Krishna will give me his mercy? Krishna will give me bhakti? No, this is not the case. Because that would mean that bhakti is dependent on achieving something within devotional service. But that's not the case. We see the example in Chaitanya Charitamrita of the illiterate Brahmin in South India. He couldn't even read the Bhagavad Gita. He couldn't even give classes. He was just sitting there with the Bhagavad Gita upside down, trying to read it. He couldn't read it. But he had that realization that Krishna is so merciful that he's becoming the servant of his devotee Arjuna. And that was a qualification for him of getting the full mercy of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So therefore, the cause of bhakti is not dependent just on the mercy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Then one may say, maybe the cause of bhakti is the causeless, unmotivated mercy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So not just the mercy of God, but the causeless, unmotivated mercy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But then one may say upon examining the situation, one may say that if the mercy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead was causeless and unmotivated, then that mercy would fall equally on every single living entity. Srimad Bhagavatam gives the example of the rain, the merciful nature of the rain. Right? Rain is so merciful that not only does it fall on fertile land where it's needed, but it also falls in the oceans where the rain is not needed. But we see that Krishna is very particular. He doesn't indiscriminately give bhakti to anyone and everyone. Therefore, the causeless, unmotivated mercy is not the reason for the manifestation of bhakti within our heart. Then the Acharyas explain that the only reason for bhakti to appear is that Krishna is partial to his devotee. Krishna is partial to his devotee, and therefore Krishna chooses who to give bhakti to. Of course, Krishna's mercy is causeless. There's nothing that we can do in devotional service to deserve to get the mercy of Krishna, to deserve to get bhakti from Krishna. There's nothing we can do. In that sense, Krishna's mercy is causeless. But still, Krishna is partial in that he chooses, he picks and he chooses whom he wants to give pure devotion to. So this is the conclusion. Then the Acharyas go on to examine, then okay, so Krishna's mercy is causeless, fine, and Krishna is partial to his devotees, fine. Then one may criticize Krishna's devotees for giving out causeless mercy in a partial way as well, specifically the Madhyama Adhikari. It's explained that the Madhyama Adhikari, specifically, is subservient to the Lord. The Madhyama Adhikari is friendly with the devotees. He is merciful to the innocent, and he disregards and stays away from the envious. So in this way, the Madhyamadhikari is discriminating as well. So we can see that the Madhyamadhikari picks and chooses who to give the causeless mercy of Krishna to. He doesn't give the causeless mercy to the envious. He gives the causeless mercy, bhakti, to people who are deserving. So one may criticize the Madhyamadhikari. You know, Krishna's mercy is causeless. Why are you just picking and choosing? Or why don't you give Krishna's mercy to anyone and everyone? But the Acharyas explain that this is a demonstration of the partiality of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. How? Krishna agrees to give his causeless mercy through the choice of his devotee. The Acharyas explain this is called Swakripa Shakti. Swakripa Shakti means that God, Krishna, bestows his devotee with the potency to be able to give his causeless mercy to anyone and everyone he chooses. And we see that fully manifested in Narada Muni. Narada Muni is fully endowed with the Swakripa Shakti of Krishna. Narada Muni can give Krishna, he can give bhakti to anyone he chooses. So the partiality of Krishna is shown in the fact that he bestows his mercy in accordance with the devotee's mercy. He says to his devotee, my mercy is fully given to you, and you can distribute my mercy to anyone and everyone you please. Now, in regards to the Madhyamadhikari, by the way, just one point on that, the Acharyas explain that just because Krishna and Krishna's devotees, specifically Krishna, just because Krishna gives his mercy to a few select people, doesn't mean that this is a bad reputation or a stain on Krishna. In fact, this is one of the opulences of Krishna. That's why Krishna is known as Dina Bandhu. That's why Krishna is known as Dinanath, Bhakta Vatsala. Because he has a favor for his devotees. So him giving his mercy to a few select people, this is one of the opulences of Krishna. It's not a fault upon Krishna, and it's not a fault upon Krishna's devotees. This is something I read from a purport in the 11th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur states that the discrimination employed by a Madhyama Adhikari does not show a lack of mercy, which is interesting. He states that upeksha, which means neglect. Neglect is the proper medicine for those who are envious of the Lord. Number one, what does that upeksha show? So when a Madhyama Adhikari shows upeksha or neglect for envious persons and he doesn't give them the mercy of Krishna, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur explains the benefits of doing that. He says, number one, this indifference or upeksha from the preacher checks feelings of hostility from both sides. If the Madhyamadhikari goes and preaches about the glories of the holy name to an envious person, then the envious person may become hostile. And the Madhyamadhikari, not being a fully self-realized pure devotee, may also become hostile towards that envious person. So by keeping a distance, it checks the feelings of hostility from both sides. Point number two, he says, if the Vaishnava acknowledged the offender's cheating and offenses will increase day by day. If the Vaishnava acknowledged the offender, in other words, the envious person, then the offender's cheating and offenses will increase day by day. We see that when we come across people, sometimes if we're giving classes, then someone may mock us, or someone may, what do they call it? When someone interrupts a class, stand-up comedy, there's a term for that. I forget. Anyway, heckler. If someone heckles us, if we acknowledge the heckler,